Thank you, Jess. I'm Claire Scorpo. I'm talking about my practice and also some of the broader things I suppose we're interested in our practice and wanting to kind of move towards. The lecture title is called Typeset, and that we'll discover later on. And basically we're looking at it through the lens of 3 projects that we've done ourselves in the last couple of years, and then also 3 kind of precedents that we're using to kind of refer back to. So, for like a sobering fact that I think everyone knows and gets bandied around all the time is that 4% of Australian building stock is designed by architects, which is always a little bit confronting given we go through so much study and we think we're kind of pushing towards the greater good, but our services aren't, highly spread across the areas. So in a map like this, 4% kind of looks like the little red dot there, so quite a minuscule amount. In the housing sector, and especially in this kind of outer suburban housing block that I've kind of chosen here, it probably wouldn't even be that. So our relevance in these areas is pretty slim. Reasons being, which is pretty obvious, is cost. It always goes down to that. So volume builders pretty much have stitched up that market completely, and you look at their cost rates per square metre and it's around a $1,200 square metre rate to do residential housing. You can get a $220,000 house and land package, which is extremely good value, and it probably has all accoutrements like media rooms and double bedrooms. Now, the reason why they can make it so affordable is their kind of business model. So they're volume builders, so they work in volume, so they're buying in volume. The way they manage their contractors, so the people that are going to be building on the site, is they've got an overall kind of structure that manages them, so it becomes very affordable and efficient. There's no downtime for their subcontractors, so they kind of produce things quickly and efficiently, and it doesn't really have anything to do with types of material or efficiencies. It's just about volume. So on the other spectrum of that, I suppose it's us, and in, again, the residential market, we're looking at rates at around 3,000 square metre upwards. So you look at some of the top tier Victorian firms, and they are substantially more than that. $10,000 a square metre for some of them, so it really is a big kind of lift on that. Again, the reasons why is these are bespoke projects, so most of the residential projects that architects are doing are one of a kind. They're prototypes, they've never been built before. You're basically setting up a small factory on the site, and that's the way you start about it. Often with single housing, there's one builder and they might have their subcontractors that they employ, so that again is not the most efficient system, and you're paying a high premium for those kind of trades. So we look at that a bit and say, there seems to be this little bit of a gap between the two. So, there's the volume builders that are kind of, running to the floor in terms of cost rates, the architects that are sky high, which is, the art of beautiful work. But there's this kind of middle ground of opportunity that I think could be fleshed out a little bit more, and I think there's ways that maybe we can investigate that a bit. So, just a very brief thing. I'm a small practice, so understandably not many people probably have heard of me. We have been operating since 2014, so it's been a couple of years, and do a bit of a mixture of residential, small commercials, starting to do a little bit of public, but all tiny, tiny scale kind of stuff. Really, when you look at the work we've been doing, we've done, worked on 32 projects and have built 14. A main bulk of those are in the residential alterations and additions area. So not new residential, just the little add-ons that happen to existing houses. These are just a selection of some of them, but really, especially when you're kind of a starting out practice and you're getting this kind of work, your budgets are tiny, so you've really got small budgets for these clients. The housing is very bespoke, so you're working with an existing house that will have all sorts of issues, and you'll never get a lovely, fresh, clean existing house. It'll be riddled with something. Clients generally have pretty big expectations on what they want. It's often their first project that they're doing, and they go to a young firm that's kind of interested in doing this work because that's kind of our bread and butter when we start out and how we can start exploring doing more work. It's kind of a folly because these kind of small projects are possibly, I would say, one of the hardest projects that you can do. Working in bigger firms previously, there's a whole range of issues. There's always difficulties in what you do, but small projects, there's no meat in them. You've got to be really, erudite in what you do. There's very little room for error, and it's high stress. So a lot of these clients don't have excess money they can pull out. They're not pitching to a corporation, so it's tough. The other thing we've always got to think about is this, like, it's a really dumb diagram, but it's that, you know, the cost, time and quality triangle. It's the magic triangle that you work at with every job, and it's the kind of saying that you can have 2 of these things but not 3. So you can only choose 2. To have something that is cheap and is quick, or you can have something that's quick and is high quality, but you can't have all these 3 things at once. So we're constantly kind of grappling with these very basic ideas and thinking about how we can make that a bit better. And we also throw into thinking those other kind of more architectural ideas of how can scale, material and simplicity kind of fold into that a bit. So I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that we've worked on, and this has come after doing a few and having, you know, budget dilemmas, high stress, all the things that kind of come with doing something for the first time on your own. So this project is the Thornbury House. So this is the one that we won an award for. It's a Californian bungalow in kind of middle suburban Melbourne. The budget was $240,000. The time was 9 months, and that was mostly because they were expecting a child, which seems to always happen. And that, of course, adds another layer of stress on top of things. Again, they had a tight budget. They didn't really want to exceed it. So before I even started the project, I was thinking, how can we do this and not cause stress, delay, that kind of thing. So that's the block. Typical double-fronted house, detached, so got 1.5 metre access on both sides and pretty even front and back. It's got a south-facing backyard, so the existing house had very little light, so we were really trying to address some of these issues. And like so much housing in Melbourne, there's the kind of existing house, then a crappy little lean-to that has been added on by someone with a hammer. So I can think about a strategy before we even started designing, and again, wanting to kind of mediate the stress. We just thought of the idea of just taking the existing house, doing minimal work to that, ditching the lean-to, then adding a really simple new volume. Now, the cheapest volume to build is a rectangle. So the simpler your overall envelope is, the less expensive it's going to be to build. So we're like, let's just keep it simple. Let's do a rectangle. Then to kind of add with that and kind of take away that, you know, end of the project, how much is this going to cost? We thought we'd get a fabricator in really, really early and speak with them about efficient systems. So we thought about this volume, how are we going to construct it? So we spoke to these people, Timber Built Solutions, who are timber coil frame manufacturers. So they've got a big factory, they CNC cut everything, and it's very efficient, and you can get pricing really early. So we thought, let's use them, let's do this kind of simple idea. How can we do something with this? So we went through a series of kind of processes and steps to how we kind of engage with the existing house and also the site. So we've got the original house, take off the lean-to, we add the new block. So at first we just bash it into the existing house, which is not a particularly lovely situation. We pull it out to kind of create a courtyard space in the middle, orient it around so it faces north, and then link it in with a library. So there's a couple of little moves, and it's using that box, but then kind of creating this idea of this link between that almost operates like a hinge between the existing building and the new. The interesting thing that we really want to encourage is kind of the landscape and how we can do simple architecture but just rely on that landscape more. So part of the kind of skewering of the box was this idea of creating these 3 courtyard spaces in between. So these courtyard spaces all had an identity as well. So one was for dining, so it was very specific adjacent to the kitchen. The back one was for the kids, so they had a whole lot of junk and stuff and cubby houses and that kind of thing, and one had their own play space. And then in between what is the study and the new wing is a little shady courtyard, so it gets very little light, but we want to kind of use that quality, and it sits adjacent to a little reading nook. So it's really about trying to let the landscape do more work and the architecture be released a little bit. The other thing in keeping it simple was the form, so we just kind of went with a simple Scallion roof, and that again was angled up, so we got as much northern light in there as possible. So yeah, you can see its relationship, I suppose, with the existing house and the library. So this is a little model we made. We make a lot of models in the studio as a way to kind of test things at a certain scale, and you know, really focused on the idea that we're interested in this like systemised kind of construction method. Using a modular component, thinking about the site and the way it responds to the site and orientation and light. And this idea of, you know, how much of this has to be, how much can we construct off-site and how much has to be constructed on-site. We don't have the kind of ability to be a greenfield site that we can bring the whole thing and sit it there and it's going to be perfect. You're negotiating with an existing building and there's all sorts of issues there. So it's really how much can we build off-site, how much can we build on-site. So we kind of came up with this idea of it being 80% fixed, which is a block volume, and 20%, my maths is really good, altered to suit. So the kind of link in the middle being the library is the kind of that 20% that's kind of modified, and the big block is the other. So sent it to these people, Timber built, they're lovely, and they came back, we sent them a Rhino model, they came back with an initial kind of structural model that showed all the structure that was going to be included in it. We also wanted to make sure it stayed cheap, and part using them was so it would have no steel in the project, so it's all laminated timber beams, so it can all be constructed pretty quickly and doesn't need another fabricator. So we got this kind of model back, and also really thrashed out the ideas and the final finishing with them early on. So the structure actually is the detail in this project, and we really wanted to make sure that was kind of the strong point. So we were able to look at, like, you know, what kind of bolts we were using, all the connections, and so all those things were kind of developed in detail with them before the project was even on site and at an early phase, which was really great. So benefits in this being that it was pretty short in terms of build time. The actual frame was put up in a couple of days, and everything was there. There was no cutting on site. It was all pre-cut, pre-drilled. All you've got to do is put it together like an IKEA bit of joinery. Then in terms of materiality, I suppose we wanted to, again, keep it efficient and affordable. So used a pretty basic suite of materials. So the cladding for the whole thing is a polycarbonate, which is kind of a relatively industrial product, though you see it in architecture as well. Way cheaper than glass. You can insulate it and it allows lovely light to come in. The actual structure, again, you know, it's all expressed so that, as I said before, kind of provides the detail, and the ply sheets to the interior. This is more expensive than plasterboard because plasterboard is the cheapest thing, but we wanted to bring some kind of quality in and some kind of depth in the kind of materiality. So that was all standard sheet sizes. Those cut efficiently. And so this was the end product. They're pretty kind of Spartan images, but it kind of shows the quality of the space and the quality of the materials. So nothing really is, we wanted to make sure nothing's really superfluous. The concrete was just a burnished finish, so just kind of left as it was. And, you know, the structure's pretty clear. The light that comes in is really lovely, but things like the kitchen joinery, it's all laminate, so, you know, we tried to pull back budget on there. You know, and kind of give a hierarchy, I suppose, of need to the big parts of the project. So that's that little one, and the clients are delightful and they're happy, which, you know, is important. We're doing another project with them. So that's that one. This one was one that came afterwards. It's a little house in St Kilda, so close to the CBD. This is a little brick and Wardian semi-detached, so it's got a big party wall in between. The budget kind of changed. It was kind of quite low to start off with, then grew a bit bigger, and then it became about 150. Had a quick timeline, was a bit staged, but we can go through that. So you can see it's the one on the right-hand side. So that's the existing plan. Basically what they want to do is refit that little laundry and make that a new laundry, and we thought, well, maybe we can do something better than that and not be too much more. We're a bit opportunistic. So we thought we can take that off and think about how we can do a similarly sized kind of micro addition to this house. So we looked at replacing that tiny little lean-to with something that's more activated and kind of can engage with the public life of that house a bit more, and also with the garden, which is, again, north is kind of perpendicular to that angle cut. So we added this 9 metre squared addition to the end of this brick house. So really we're trying to keep that work confined. Again, I think we tried to use landscape a bit more to really make it feel bigger than it was, and kind of the angle kind of helps to open up that courtyard space and bring it all in. The other thing we were conscious of was, in such like a mean plan kind of size, where do you get a sense of space and volume? So we looked at the kind of importance of a vertical kind Plain. So it's very high, which kind of reflects the existing house, but it's very kind of compact in its footprint. This kind of carried on over to the external space, and in a way we were really wanting to frame that external space so you could actually feel the volume of the outside as opposed to being just an open kind of canyon. So again, we thought we'd go to these timber build people because we liked them and we had a good experience. So we sent them the plans and saw if they could do this in prefab and, you know, if we could get that as part of the process early on. This didn't work so much, so this was about 20 to 30 grand just for the frame. It's tiny, so it was really, it didn't stack up, so it was of the wrong scale and it just didn't have that kind of scale of efficiency that the other project did. So that was a shame. So we had to move on to other things. So instead we kind of minimised the trade, so we used IKEA joinery throughout and got a kind of hip furniture maker who does little ply things to do the shelves. So, you know, we tried to minimise on some of those things there. So the project in the end kind of came out like this. It does look like a shed, which one of the builders always tells me my projects look like sheds. I said that's okay. But you kind of get a sense of, you know, there's little moments within. Again, we used the amperlight as a way to kind of cut costs on the glazing and bring nice diffuse light into that area. And, you know, using again the ply because it's got a little bit of depth to it as a way to kind of transition the kind of service spaces into the kitchen areas and, you know, the qualities of those through there. So, yeah, so that was good. So we had these two projects that we thought had some ideas. They need to be refined. Like, they still weren't really right, but, you know, we wanted to see what we could do with them. So we kind of did as, you know, as when you're a student, when you don't know what to do, you kind of look back at precedent and think, well, how can we maybe do these better? And we're also thinking about what we wanted to do as a practice. In a way, a common trajectory for small practices is you start with cheap, small work, you slowly get more budgets, and then you can do some luxury houses and start putting, like, you know, fancy finishes on and that kind of thing. But in a way, we're kind of more compelled to kind of stay low and stay cheap and try and think about how we can do it better. And that's, I suppose, where we're in the position of at the moment. So we then kind of thought, well, what do we want to be? And we thought maybe it's kind of that in-between space between the Cotton On and the Chanel of the fashion world. So, you know, there's a similarities in that, you know, Cotton On, it's on trend and it's cheap and cheerful. It's probably produced in some unfortunate place, but, you know, it's cheap. And then Chanel, like, you think about the labour that goes into that. It's high labour. It's all bespoke, and that's really what architecture is when you're looking at bespoke housing. Like, there's so much care, thought and detail that goes into it. So it's not too different from that. So how do we sit in the middle? So I talk quickly. We look at precedents. So I suppose I'm going to look at 3 different precedents, and I'll go through them relatively quickly. And I'm just touching on them. They're great precedents, so it's worth having a look at as well. They're nice ones to kind of inform things and talk about our history a bit. But the first one we want to look at in terms of affordable housing is the Aged Small Home Service. So this was it was part of a publication, so it was part of the Aged newspaper. They basically put out plans, so it was a bit of an open source kind of plan market where you paid, I think, £5 per plan. Robin Boyd was at the forefront of this, as well as Neil Clarahan and others, so they had top architects engaged in this and writing about this kind of stuff as well in the paper to accompany these plans. And anyone could go and buy these plans. They had a set number that they had to, like, you couldn't build more than 50 of these projects, and then they'll cycle through new plans. But, you know, the idea is anyone could go, buy the plan, find themselves a builder and build it. So, you know, there wasn't any rigorous checking or all the kind of administration that goes along with an architect administered project. It was open source. You could do what you want with them. It was also important because they were still small, so it's 120 square metres with kind of the size of most of these houses. And they were also flexible, so a lot of them allowed for expansion later on, so they weren't about giving the set kind of house, which if you think about current volume builder houses, there's no way you're going to be doing anything with those once it's built. So this gives you an opportunity to enhance or grow or change it in some way later down the track. There's a couple of different types of houses. So there were these kind of ones, so the Fleur expandable home, which was a good example of a bit more contemporary thinking in terms of planning. So even now, like that plan's a delightful plan, and I think that still, you know, would work in today's kind of day. Has good zoning, and you know, it's efficient. It's curious because you look at that kind of project, and now with all the kind of mid-century housing love that everyone has at the moment, everyone wants this kind of thing, and this used to be the affordable housing, but as the way it is, you know, this was post-war and steel was relatively cheap, so these things could be built pretty quickly. Labour wasn't expensive as it is now, so these kind of things are expensive to build now, so not really possible. The other houses that were part of this small home service were houses like this. I think it's a T12 house, so it was an iterative, like it was a very, very simple iteration. Roland Boyd spoke about this one being, you know, it's a rectangle, so it's cheap to build. And you look at it from the outside, I don't think anyone would walk past that and say, wow, that's phenomenal, that is architecture. It looks pretty modest. But you look at the planning, and it's a really efficient plan. It's been well laid out, and the spaces within the house are really good. So you look, I don't know, we look at a project like this and think, what's good about this project, and you know, what can we take from it? And I suppose some of the ideas are things like, you know, the moves in this are spatial, not formal. There's something about the bones of the project. The plan works well, the spaces work well. The materiality, it doesn't matter. The formal kind of composition, that's kind of, you know, secondary as well. So it's got a lot of humility in it, and I think there's some lessons in learning that, you know, we don't have to always have, you know, big, bold kind of moves. We can be pretty modest and restrained. So yeah, there I suppose the kind of methods and lessons we can learn. So something that has good bones, and I know Kirsten Thompson speaks about B-grade buildings, which I always love when she talks about that, because I think they're quite interesting. The idea that, you know, the base, the kind of the fundamental parts of it are really considered, but, you know, maybe the resolution isn't to that high level of kind of awards. So the second kind of precedent I wanted to look at were the merchant builders. So they were a bit later, they were 1965 to 91. They kind of fizzled out. They were volume builders, so they were actually builders that engaged architects to design the plans for them and use that as a kind of marketing tool. So when you're buying something from merchant builders, the idea was it was a top quality product, like it was a quality product. You know, it wasn't top tier, but it was still good quality architecture, and it linked architects in. So Graham Gunn is probably the most well-known kind of advocate for the merchant builders. Again, it kind of gave agency to the owner in terms of how they procured the project. The other thing they did, which was very interesting, is this idea of a cluster housing plan. So when you look at these two blocks, you know, the top shows a standard subdivision, quarter-acre block, so houses on their own site with a bit of a boundary on either side and kind of inefficient use of the outdoor space. What they're proposing in the cluster housing model is some of the private land gets given over to the public, and also the existing landscape plays a really big role in setting out the plan. So you might have a smaller backyard, but then you've got this like really lovely public space that you can share with the other owners of these houses. So it was a bit of more of a communal living style. And there's a couple of really good examples in Melbourne of this. Speaking of like the agency they gave to the owner, they also looked at typologies as a way to develop their plan. So they had the terrace house typology, the courtyard house, the corner house. So they attached this kind of spatial idea to their kind of planning methods. They offered this complete package, and landscape was really well considered in it. So they had landscape architects working for them, tracked up landscape architects who are now big, kind of started out with the merchant builders. They're really well zoned, so again, they've got the flexibility some of the small homes projects had, and they were very key on orientation. So these were oriented kind of houses. Materiality-wise, again, you know, at the time, timber wasn't expensive as it is now, and some of these expressive materials might be more to build with, but it was all about kind of natural materials. They were relatively modest, so ceiling heights were pretty small, within like 2.7 kind of maximum. So they weren't kind of voluminous houses, but they very much, you know, used things like, for verandas and eaves to kind of block the sun so they're site responsive and engage with the outdoors. As a little aside, I don't know, history I think is important to kind of think about with what you do, and I was obsessed with this kind of stuff like kind of recently, and then I thought back to why, and I used to live in one of these houses, so that was the one I lived in. And it was very efficient and it worked well because my nana at the time lived in one end and we lived down the other end, and there was a big pool and I had a whole lot of people that lived there that I knew. So it was a kind of social environment. Some say it kind of failed, but I think it's still a pretty successful kind of example of how that might work. So lessons in this, I'd say, you know, the landscape optimisation and really kind of pulling that landscape in. It's kind of this urban plan that they're thinking about structuring, and also the orientation in the planning, as well as a few other things. The last precedent I touch on is Jorn Utzon, of course the Opera House. He did this project in Denmark called the Expansiva project, which is about kind of additive housing. It started in 1969 and there's several iterations all throughout Denmark of this. The idea being with this is it's modular and it can be reconfigured and replanned depending on the site, so it's highly site responsive. Some of these sites have got, lots of slopes and, curious terrain. And similar to the cluster housing model of the merchant builders, they really were looking at how do you divide external landscape space. So, it was highly modulated, so the structure was considered, then the cladding components were all moduled, and they kind of went together depending on how the planning went for the house. So the components can be added to the building and they don't need to be cut or measured, so there's a real efficiency of materiality there. So interestingly, really, it's that real courtyard planning where they're looking at that internal volume and making that external space part of the house, as opposed to being that green soup that kind of goes around. And the structure is expressed in the interior, so again, those elements kind of give detail to the house. These kind of oversized beams, like, pretty delightful. So in the end, this, I suppose, that idea of the systemised construction is something to really look at, and something that's site responsive, has courtyard planning, and really engages the landscape. So there are the three precedents. Given those, I suppose, I was wanting to look into a project we're working on at the moment. And this is a project we got relatively recently, which is a house in Albert Park. This is a double-fronted Victorian weatherboard with a budget of $280,000. So what we want to do in this project is, I think, pull a few ideas from each of those three precedents that we're looking at. So from the merchant builders, just looking at that landscape or that urban figure, the landscape figure. So how can we plan the landscape to better integrate with a house? Utzon, we're looking at the idea of systemised planning, so what can be quite rational in this kind of sense of planning that we're doing. And the Boyd kind of stuff, it's humble tectonic, so how can we just create dumb volumes but do something with those? So that's the existing house that we're working with. It's got that standard kind of thing where house is in a block and then big backyard. And I always think the issue with that is, yeah, it's huge and people love saying they've got a big backyard, but your kind of engagement with it is just so singular. Like, you're always looking out on one perspective and that's all you get. And unless you're middle of summer and you're out there enjoying it, you've got this singular perspective that you're always looking out on. So you never get much depth to it at all. So we looked at that site and how we could kind of work some of these ideas into it. So, like, pretty much, I'd say 100% of all alts and ads that we look at, it's generally demolishing the lean-to and keeping the original structure. Then we think about the volume that's needed for what they require, and then splitting it into two. Again, we kind of think about solar access and how we can kind of modify these kind of dumb blocks, and then finally, similar to the Thornbury project, thinking about how we can link them together. So that's the proposed plan as it is now. So just going through it again, the existing house is there. The idea for this is we're using these two modules, so we are working with Timber Build again with this, so we've started kind of developing a system for these two. So these are two pretty simple volumes that are on the site. Then there's the links to the existing, which aren't part of that same system, so a bit different. And almost most importantly is the figure of the landscape and how that can come in and impact upon the site, even though the forms themselves are pretty square and basic. So that's a little axo of it. These are little sections that kind of show how we can, especially the bottom one, like cut up the kind of internal spaces using the outdoors a bit, and what we want to achieve with it. So we wanted to kind of develop a simple tectonic. We wanted to have a spatial quality as opposed to maybe materiality quality. So the idea for the materials is it'll be clad pretty much with cement sheet or something quite inexpensive, and then that ratio of fixed to flexible. So just to finalise, I suppose we're thinking about what this might go on to, and these three projects I suppose I presented are each, in a way, their own typology, and that's why I've kind of pulled them out. So much of the time if you're doing this kind of work in Melbourne, you're confronted with a few different types, and one is that large kind of block. It's a double-fronted house. It's completely detached. So that's one typology we kind of look at. It's always got the central kind of corridor generally, or there's one that comes to the side. Then the medium scale is the double-fronted, but without that kind of excess yard. So you're generally building to boundaries on something like that. So that last project was one of those. And then there's the small, which are the single-fronted, often attached, at least on one side and sometimes two. And that's got that standard shotgun kind of corridor with all the rooms branching off it. So typical kind of Victorian house. So that's where we step back and we kind of say, well, what are these in terms of their different types? Then I suppose we step back again. Oh, they're so fuzzy. And we look at the other projects we're working on at the moment, and again, we can just classify them in terms of their different typologies. So again, the double-fronted detached, the double-fronted single semi-detached, and then the single-fronted semi-detached, and they all have their own kind of quirks in the way that we can work with those. Yeah, so it was kind of difficult thinking about how to kind of wrap up something that we're halfway kind of through and kind of working through. So I suppose, it is kind of posing the question of how we might kind of think about, building and designing in a way that might be more affordable and a bit more efficient. And instead of looking at these projects as complete individual bespoke projects, how can we step back from that a little bit and kind of classify them and think of them as iterations of the same thing? So it's really thinking about how can we bring sameness into these very different projects, and how can we, take scale out so we kind of have a clear lens to look over them and try and find all the similarities of these projects so we can put together a solution that might be able to be applied in multiple times as opposed to just once. So I suppose, to end, it's kind of looking at that question of how can we make a little bit more of an impact. This is pretty small scale stuff. I'm not talking about, big buildings or big land masses. It's kind of small, small iterations at a time, and trying to work with what we've got on and how we work and trying to make it better. So the idea is kind of how can we make, architecture in some response a bit more affordable to the person, and, one day we can take it all over. That's all.